ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Should we start? They're
Oh,
on.
it's not.
It's on now?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. We can wrap up any questions, discussion on the first part of this section, which is on the market and economy. We talked about linking Marx with Adam Smith, and the two different ways are illustrated by Saskia Sassen's work and Paul Peterson's. Peterson is closer to Adam Smith. Saskia has a little more of Marx's idea, but neither of them really stress those broader theoretical implications. They write more as if it's obvious and descriptive, but they don't in that way give us a framework, especially for comparison, that would include China and the West, Western Europe, and let's say U.S. and Latin America, and a way to frame these. And we're building that up in the other earlier sections as we'll continue through the course. We'll add different components that gives a global perspective. The next big piece of building that framework, and as we're introducing 5 theoretical perspectives, and what we're doing is joining all 5 and building a framework. The first is leadership, like Roosevelt, and we saw the way of reinterpreting the cutbacks from the Roosevelt New Deal growth of government, and people often interpreted this as a cutback due to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. I would say the great majority of historians and political scientists say that as a fact, and they're wrong. And so as we look more closely and we went through the evidence, there was a lot of bottom-up, not just a top-down, but bottom-up in that way is difficult to measure, and that's what we gave you some illustrations. And so in conjunction with this, beyond the first section on leadership, we then go into markets. The third section we're now beginning is what lots of people call culture and political culture. The concept of political culture was largely developed by Edward Shills here at the University of Chicago. He was here as well as working on teaching in England, as well as translating the work of Max Weber from German. So he built a cosmopolitan, more European-focused theory background and linked it to the more empirical work, inductive from the bottom, from the perspective of the Chicago sociology, which was the main place where sociology was first developed in the U.S. But it had weak theory. The theory was adapted heavily from Darwin. We talked about the ecology and about no mind, no culture in people's heads. The concepts came from Darwin, such as competition, domination, exploitation, succession, moving out of one neighborhood to another, and so forth. One could map some of these, and that was done in the early stages, but they didn't really do that with actual data that was seriously mapped in any way that we do now all the time with the computers. The transformation came by adding not only the theory from Max Weber, by giving a global perspective of looking at Europe, within Europe, the northern versus the south, the Protestant versus Catholic, and then within the Protestants he would stress which type, and the 2 biggest types were Calvin and the silly blocking of names here for a moment. Okay, the Calvinists were the most bottom up in their theology, and the perspective of joining these was done, but not in a very systematic way by Max Weber. The later theorists, later interpreters began to carve out these distinct concepts such as values, norms. Values can be broader concepts like egalitarianism or tradition, hierarchy, deference, these things. Norms could, don't cross the street if the light is red. So the norms are your behavior in a particular context. So values and norms were introduced as major concepts from culture generally, and these came in part from anthropology and from theories of which Weber broadly used, but was articulated more sharply in the work of Talcott Parsons, for example, and then his students would sharpen these kinds of concepts. The empirical data came initially from case studies of one neighborhood, one kind of issue such as one factory, or one institution like a dance hall, or the black neighborhood. The second way is to try to take these kinds of I'm mentioning just one or two quick examples. A major one that was links also with what we're talking about with the new political culture is the strong egalitarian kind of democracy, where one person, one vote is a strong and a normatively criticized if we do not have any kind of violation from equality in a strict, every person is totally equal. And that has been more and more normatively imposed with a stronger sense of egalitarianism over several centuries. The men and women, animals, animal rights, children's rights, etc. The other side is not to use an ideology and a normative framework in that sense to say, I'm in favor of more equality and therefore we will create a republic instead of a king, as they did in France in the 19th century, and we will have used the state to impose stronger equality, as in the 1789 French Revolution. This perspective of democracy and governance came in part inspired by Calvinism as a theology, as a religious perspective, where those big religious ideas, which could be found in the Bible, Christian Bible, or in theologies of other sorts. But when we move to Asia, and this is what Weber then explored in his books on India and China, where personal relationships were more salient and central in a broader perspective of many domains. These in turn could be linked with also the economic base of agriculture. And so much of the world was agriculturally dominated in terms of its economy until the 19th century. With the Industrial Revolution, we have the efficient manufacturing of large numbers of products, physical products. And then we had Marxism. We have an effort to classify these types into such kind of big concepts as, these books are for you. You can please borrow them, but take a look, and you can take them. You can look at them now during the class, and then you can take them with you. These fit with the class also today. Yeah, for you. The personal relations, thus, we can simply term it, sometimes have a framework which suggests agriculture implies a patron and followers, or master and slaves, and in the slave version within the American South. Not just there, but also in slaves in many other parts of the world, from Egypt onward. The version in Chicago with the Irish Catholic leadership form of patronage would stress 3 types of participants. We'll pursue this a little further later on, but I'm giving you these big types to illustrate and say these are different types of political cultures, and they in turn link with ways of using institutions. Even the same legal institutions get redefined and reused in a different way. So the dailies in Chicago in the mid-20th century to the end basically stressed traditionally a political candidate, such as for mayor or an alderman, and they in turn would have political organizers. And the political organizers could be people who, from a political activism standpoint, could do what our current mayor in Chicago did. He would work with the teachers' union to mobilize people to support teachers' issues, especially higher salary, more pay for Chicago teachers. And so they would do that. They would do things like parades, posters, demonstrations, strikes in the strongest form, but lots of continuing activity. Why did these people do political campaigning? Classically, because they had a job. The job was not to do political campaigning. The job was, for instance, to work in the Parks Department, but maybe they didn't really do anything in the parks. In the Chicago Parks and Recreation section was the classic area where they may have been the wife, a daughter, a son, who would have a job in the Parks Department, but they were so-called no-show jobs. They did nothing in terms of the parks, but they got paid from the city, not the city government itself, but from the Parks District, which in this case of Chicago was a legally separate entity. So the political candidate supported these organizers. The organizers in turn gave normally, ideally, a material reward, such as helping. If you're the son, well, let's say, but one more. We have someone who's in the park district. Nevertheless, you can give some kind of reward, such as you may recruit under him precinct captains, to use the terms in Chicago with the Democratic Party's terms. The precinct captains would organize one individual precinct, and my building is a high-rise 19-story building. One building is one precinct. It can be a small neighborhood, a few blocks. So a precinct is a quite small entity, and they were seen as the major drivers of the political machine in Chicago. So the precinct captains would then often give personal help if a parking ticket, a theft, a son stole some liquor. The police arrest him. They take him to jail. He's let go on condition that he come back in a month. He goes, or his mother goes to the precinct captain and says, "My son is in trouble. Can you help?" He said, "We'll take care of it. Remember us on election day." And so the exchange for the favor is to get in back a vote. All right, so that vote goes back to the political leaders. So we have a circular set of exchanges by each of these three kinds of non-ideological, non-theological, no norms, no values, except you give me, I give you that, in a set of values and norms which we can articulate as distinct from, or which we've called in the case of the version that is best known, has been best documented as the Italians and the Irish ethnic migrants to the U.S., but also within Ireland, within Italy, they do it nationally, extensively. It's very strong going on in two ways that in the last 20 years, if you will. These two are more visibly in conflict, sometimes by the same entities. And this is happening in France, what's happening within China, it's happening within Chicago. And so we had with Jane Byrne, she ran as a reformer. Once elected, she governed primarily as a machine leader, and she raised more money by far than the Dailies ever did by getting material contributions to her campaigns. Harold Washington is the person who really transformed the values of Chicago. He really brought, and among African Americans, you have two traditions. You have the machine group, and Harold Washington himself and his own father worked with the machine of the Democratic Party. They ran in the traditional manner, and they expected that at least they would do it that way. That's the only kind of politics they knew of. When Harold Washington was recruited to fight against Jane Byrne, a new group which came from the South, which was more influenced by Martin Luther King, and it was more religious. These were clergymen, and they called upon God. They called for religious hymns. They sang songs. They said prayers and the like. And they said, we want to have the Bible be used in our daily lives and in our politics. Not to say these are two separate things. And with Dorothy Tillman, I mentioned last time, with her hats, she dropped out of high school at 17. She organized. She came to when they succeeded with, in 1965, national laws for civil rights successfully in the South, in spreading those northern values, if you will, into the American South. They then said with Martin Luther King, we're now going to go to the North. Well, and so they toured the North. Where would we go? Where would we do to have the most impact? And their answer was Chicago. We had the toughest political machine. We had a big city. We had a lot of visible political organization, which we could potentially change. And they attacked. They lost. Daley won. For 20 years, basically, Dorothy Tillman and the others tried to organize to look for a way to somehow confront the machine, and they waited until they finally found Harold Washington, and he was then elected. He in turn tried to appoint Dorothy Tillman for a year, and it only happened after much resistance, because Harold Washington had a minority of the city council members. Nevertheless, he, and and this we've documented in our oral history, and I'm giving you sort of the Chicago version, but I'm illustrating this to link with national and international processes that were very analogous to those in Chicago. That is, so-called corruption, fighting against reformers. The Irish and the Catholic versus the Protestant, and especially the Calvinist. These we then could link with increased education, increased cosmopolitanism, more resources available to more people with these things in their heads, that there are different ways to organize themselves and to access new ways of thinking, such as using and creating social media for linking with international civic organizations such as unions, environment, or the beyond the unions, which was linked to the old production. The consumption issues became an explosion with women, the environment, human rights, gays and lesbians, and the like from the 1970s onward, with the issues of diversity today, and that we've talked about. But the point is, where and how do these things work in terms of political culture? Where and why do these make more of a difference? And that's where we introduce here usefully Daniel Elazar. So Elazar stresses that the main way in which well, we could say beyond, separate from Elazar, if we add Parsons or others, where and how do you get change in culture? One is that people move. New people move in. New people come to Chicago from Germany, from Italy, from Ireland. And they bring their values, their lifestyle with them, their language often. And then these second, in the next generation, you have socialization of the young people within an Irish neighborhood, Bridgeport in Chicago. These in turn, these two types, migration and socialization, are going on clearly all around the world. But we can then try to push on further and say, where and why might these, what do you do if you have different values, different types of, in the case of and that is in the 21st century. I mentioned briefly the physics professor in Florence, Italy, who was elected mayor, and he actively used the environment and environmental issues as a way of trying to say, this is lifestyle. We want the air to be cleaner. We want the streets to be cleaner. We want to have recycling. We want to have garbage recycled in a way that it is used in a way that it is not simply burned or thrown away. These were then used, and in terms of seeing this within the city of Chicago, we had three versions of political culture which are fighting with one another, which are linked initially with the New Englanders, who were primarily Calvinist and who had come, all three of these really came from England. But these initially, historically, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. The Calvinists had a theological perspective that we must do this because this is in the Bible. We take the Bible seriously. We want to have egalitarianism. We want to have democratic participation. And these will be important to have implemented in a more religious bottom-up way. The Middle Atlantic set of migrants came from initially term was New Amsterdam was the name of the city, which then became New York. So New Amsterdam is where they first had a stock market, and then it went to London. So Donald Trump, with his book on the contract, these contracts were the alternative to a norm or a value in a sense, or it's a type of norm or value which is highly short-term, limited, specific. And so the way that sometimes described is that people may go to New York or Chicago, they meet at the airport, 3 people from 3 different companies may have signed a contract in 5 minutes, they have to sign the signatures and they go home. If they go to the South, the American South, or if they go to okay. An alternative is to build up a stronger set of personal relationships. So you can see and feel a sense of trust, building trust based on exchanges of personal discussions, getting to know people at least a little bit, is classically done if people would meet in Houston or Dallas. They wouldn't sign a contract right away. They would, and so that sense of building new relationships is illustrated by the third type of Elazar. People came with slaves. They were first called indentured servants, the English term. These are people who may have stolen a silver spoon from a table, but they may have 5 years of being an indentured servant. And then when the jails were filled, they put them in ships around London and other places. When the ships were filled, they didn't have any more places to go. The king gave more and more pardons, and there was more and more sense that this is too strict. We must have a different way of changing our system. But that partially began to happen. They didn't have enough places. But then they sent many of those ships. They tried to go to South Africa, and they couldn't find a place to go which seemed suitable for a harbor, and so they went to Australia. So Australia was a country peopled by convicts, criminals in their legal system. But they have become today some of the most law-abiding of the old English colonies of any, to a striking degree. When the light is red, everybody stops. When people are driving, they don't go above the speed limit, etc. Very different from the US and Canada in the middle, and then say England there to have those three variations, 3 types of political cultures where we have variations in the degree to which these strongly general values such as egalitarianism or following the law, which is don't cross the road if the light is red. In Australia, they do it much more seriously. So what Elazar has done was publish some 50 books of implementing these ideas. I've given you the top of the iceberg, the easy, simple version, but he traced this all the way back to the Bible and to the ancient Greek works of Aristotle, Plato, and so forth, and showed that they were combined in Western literature, in Western normative perspectives, Western law, and that in these ways, Western values were distinct from those of the rest of the world, where personal relationships were more central and more visible, and documented, of course, with India and China from Max Weber. The big contribution, there was a 4-volume series from Elazar, was tracing a different concept which also begins with C, as was used in the legal tradition or in the book of Donald Trump, called the contract, which instead, or another term with a C, is the covenant. The covenant has a religious, moral element the ideal type was that when, from the Bible, the Old Testament, when the Jews were as slaves within Egypt, were escaping their slavery, they crossed the Nile, they reached to the other side through whatever godlike hand facilitated that. Moses went up to the top of the mountain, met with God, and brought back a set of, later on was transformed into the 10 Commandments. So if you will, the covenant was, these are the chosen people, these are religiously identified as a distinctive social group, and they are blessed by God. This model of having a covenant where the state is joined with the heavenly word and the hand of God to persuade and to maintain these legal and state institutions, leads to, in those societies where this covenant foundation is stronger, are different from those which are more like the Middle Atlantic and the South in these cases. And so these international comparisons he then pursues with, for instance, Iceland has some of the strongest covenants and the strongest ways in which governance is celebrated with holidays, with religious ceremonies, and so forth. These are found especially in those with Calvinist background, as in parts of England, with the Netherlands and with Switzerland. These were the two countries which were most strongly Calvinist with these sorts. Okay, I've given you a bit of this in the bigger broad history from Elazar. He also then has several, I think there were 4 volumes of studies from his, well, he was raised as the son of a rabbi in Minneapolis. They moved to Chicago when he was a young man, and so he grew up in the Calvinist combined with Lutheran, combined with Jewish background in Minneapolis. But coming to Chicago, he then confronted the daily style political machine, and he simply did not try to dismiss this, but tried to say, what did this work? What held together the machine in such a forceful way? He got a PhD in political theory at the University of Chicago. He knew about Edward Shills, he knew about Max Weber. He got his first job at Urbana, and he wrote a brilliant book which could be seen, written, and highly inspired by the Bible and Old Testament related work, the Torah, and so forth. But it was about data of 3 kinds of cities in the state of Illinois: the North, the Middle, and the South. All 3 of these political cultures are all found within Illinois. In Rockford, a more pure New England town, was the source of Jane Addams. And the Middle Atlantic was more of the machine and the Irish Catholics, if you will. And among the African Americans, we have the South, not just the slavery, but the slaves reacting against slavery in the sense of justice and themes of retribution, of making good for what was taken away from the exploitation of the past. And these kinds of three sets of themes you could find not only in the city of Chicago, but he then traces other ideal types of small towns across Illinois, and then he returned to these 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, and he's documented these in a remarkable series of works right here. So we have a Elazar doing these. He and I worked with him increasingly, and he then learned about what I was doing with this book, The New Political Culture, and he said, we can join the two. What he has done is the history, the background, and what leads to these kinds of political culture. This book does the opposite. It starts, what it does is to say, where and why does culture change? So it's not, so political culture is primarily a dependent variable, not an independent variable here. So if we have, could we show, please, we have our official teaching assistant giving us the show.
Wait, I have a question.
Go ahead.
You said something like Illinois has 3 political cultures.
Yes.
One in Rockford, I assume one in Chicago. Where's the third?
The South, so Southern Illinois.
Southern Illinois. Okay.
Yeah, so smaller towns, but yes, in
So
small.
like towards like the Indiana border.
Yes.
And what's the political ideology there?
Let me see if we can, what we want, or what I sent to you. Oh, it's an email, and it has their pictures. And so I think these are the recommended books that you purchase, and these contrast with different. The first one looks like this, and the second one looks like. The third looks like this. I sent these to you in an email about 2 o'clock. I forgot. Sometime today. Maybe my return, because after that, it was, maybe it says it had my name of urban, maybe my return address was urban innovation. Was that, maybe that confused you? And it didn't say Terry Clark, but urban innovation analysis, UIA. Okay, so you don't remember so okay, we'll work on that a little bit. I'll introduce the general ideas. The first one, well, I mean, I think I can do them from here if you you don't find the email from me.
Yeah, I didn't find this. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can easily pull these up. These are, I put them in pictures, so if I go to photos here, they come down to these here. And let me try to just to take the plug, the cable. Try to put this in here. Okay. Okay, see, yeah, this is what I would hope you would do. See, these are sideways. That's the problem. But if you tip your head sideways like this, what these show is over time, and this, let me,
You could rotate it.
that's what it can be done.
Okay. All right.
That's what I hope I would have some help on. and not try to do it while you're struggling here. What this shows is changes from 1970 on the bottom up to the end of the 20th century. And what we basically had were the changes in value orientations of 6 West European publics. These were France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Belgium, based on representative national surveys of publics of these countries through the European Community Surveys and the Eurobarometer surveys. The guy who really organized this was Ronald Engelhardt. He was a graduate at USC and professor for many years at the University of Michigan and in Germany. So he and I then did a chapter in this book together, and what he showed was the decline of some of those values which were measured with things like, is it important to give more money to workers, and is that an important way of building a stronger society? So more jobs, more people, and there was I've forgotten what his item. There initially had 4 items, then it went to 12 items. It basically had material rewards, and he had abstract things like making the city a more beautiful place, and making democracy with egalitarian ideals be more generalized. So basically, he built a new set of values, and this shows what this adds: the ages, that is, young people versus older people. That is, people who were born in 1906. The bottom line, the bottom line here are the older people. That is, what's this saying is that over the 20th century, more and more people were getting to support these kinds of idealistic, non-material values, and that these, within each cohort, with each time period, these tended to be the youngest and the most, and in other analyses, which we do in the rest of the book, we take, here we go. Women should have the same chances as men to gain political office. More severe penalties should be introduced for acts of terrorism. These are stronger measures should be taken to protect the environment, etc. Okay, so the rise of these values link with the transformation moving in the direction of what Elazar talked about as coming from New England. Okay, so what we've then done is to look at these more internationally with lots of surveys. So Elazar generally has not had quantitative data with survey material for many cities or many types of citizens, whereas Engelhardt and I have had both the qualitative, historical, and the quantitative to compare. So we can not only say they've changed, but we try to say how important are each of the following 10 or 15 variables, so we can control party, education, religion, number of terms as as mayor, sex of the gender of the mayors, where we have surveys of mayors here. Okay, so just to push on with this one. This is the traditional background of, this is page 34. The first one was, just for you, have a copy at home or something, it's page 31, and we go to page 34. As in most of my books, the key ideas you can find in 1 or 2 pictures. Look at the figures. And I'll try to show those to you here so you can see the big points. Okay, what this shows is traditional stratification hierarchies on the bottom, on the left. These are high income, high occupation, high education, high status versus low status, low income, low occupation. Then we have corresponding organized groups, social clubs, civic groups, business groups, chamber of commerce versus trade unions, ethnic groups, neighborhood groups, padrone. These are really high versus low. And the clear ideological cleavages are at the top, the traditional right parties. They're fiscally conservative and socially conservative. Whereas the traditional left parties are fiscally liberal, they want to spend more, raise taxes and spend more money, and they want to be more socially liberal, such as equal rights for African Americans or for workers. Okay, this is old politics. This is 19th century politics, if you will, in this page. Over the 20th century, we have the emergence of different kinds of. Now I go to the next figure. We have different kinds of issues. That is not just party programs, but we have issue politics, which I've talked about from Dahl. And the three cleavages down there are pro-elderly, pro-ecology, and pro-sports clubs as three examples. And so these kinds of things need not be rich versus poor. People can support ecology or sports clubs if they're poor or they're rich and so forth, or they're high and low education. So there tends to be a decline of the social class as a driver, and in a separate book, separate paper I did with Lipset called Our Social Classes Dying. And we brought in some of these core ideas in one little paper, which has been more widely cited as a clear, simple version of this kind of argument. This is the more general analytical framework I gave you a quick version of last week. And what we have are three boxes: economic, social, and government. And within each of these, we have the emergence of individualism. In the first, it's a market individualism. In the second one, is more tolerance of individual and group variations, social individualism within the slimming of the family, with more education driving this. And third, governance, the developed welfare state programs which have, in a sense, solved, quote, the most urgent problems of the past, hunger, housing, and these three combine to generate a new political culture. So these are the three boxes in summary. Then we have a chapter with about 20 specific propositions, such as the higher the level of income and the more steady the economic growth of a society, the more stable and affluent is each individual, the more fiscally conservative they are. So those kinds of propositions we then review with some of the evidence which was available from many different sources. This was one of 6 books which then pursue these ideas to test these ideas. So this has especially introducing these propositions in this kind of framework. And then there's case studies with some of the. Here's just one example showing you political parties are very strong still in Western Europe. The case is on the right. England, Germany, France, these were relatively important. By contrast, the US, Canada, and Australia have low, not very important black political parties, and instead civic organizations are more important. So we have shifting away from the traditional 19th century patterns from the old political culture to this new political culture, which is defined in those terms. Okay, let me discuss in any way you do or you'd like to raise.
go first.
I've sent you a version of this applied to China. If you want to raise anything from that, which is from the Chinese case, that would be fine. One dramatic thing, which is not so much in the papers, this is newer, but I'll simply mention, linking to this picture. In the field work we've been having, we've seen dozens of ethnographics. We've had people from most of the top people, most of the people who are active in as academics or whatever. They're members of the Communist Party. But what does the role of the party as an organization do? And the answers are many, many different things. But what I would say is striking to me is seeing that the political party working in individual neighborhoods in a Chinese city does things as we do in the US. We'll have urban renewal, we'll tear down 5 blocks, and then the question is, what will we replace them with? And in the case of where I live, in Bronzeville, we have a great big Michael Reese Hospital, which has been vacant land for about 10 years. We can't find investors or entrepreneurs to build anything. Where it belongs to now, the city of Chicago, and they can't sell it to anyone to buy it that will really develop it. In China, the Communist Party plays a more active role. And what we've heard in a number of cases is having political meetings, either with a small group or people living in a street. What would you like to have if we rebuild this street? And one will say, we'd like a grocery store, we'd like to have a gas station, we'd like to have a clothing shop, we'd like to have a children's clothing store. And they do it. That is bottom up. They ask citizens, what would you like to have? And the answer is, you don't need to have a market. You could use the party to make decisions, even if there's not enough money. In the case, that is, we're waiting for the market to work for Michael Reese in Chicago, and it's failing. So what some of them will say, and so the aldermen in the area, so I'm advising the aldermen on these issues. The alderman has tried to do some things, and they try to get the city government to pay, and the city government is more cautious about not spending too much. So we're now doing a little bit through the library. So we're trying to have a Bronzeville museum or a sort of a welcoming center, and use this to link with tourism. Question, comment?
Why wouldn't the city of Chicago do something kind of more in the middle, like create incentives for businesses to open up in Bronzeville, like maybe a tax cut or something? They can't put up the money now or something. I don't know why they wouldn't do that.
Well, many of the taxes are legally restricted to be imposed by the national government or the state government. Usually most cities are largely regulated by states.
Yeah.
And so the states say you can't have an income tax, you can't raise property taxes unless they're usually local, so the revenue structures can vary. And the quick answer is they're doing it. I mean, and this is now being discussed much more explicitly in the case of Harris. I mean, Harris has got a number of she doesn't have a systematic, if you will, general economic program, but she's got lots of little targeted bits of money for a new couple who wants to build a house. They get $25,000 she's proposing, etc. So those kind, and there's another one is to help small businesses. So yes, but that's proposed by a candidate for president of the national U.S. government, and those are, and the idea is these would be national, not city specific. So Peterson, as I talked about briefly last time, the Peterson idea is you can, for economic development, local business activity is great, and there tends to be more consensus. You deal with allocational services like fire and police, people fight over it and no one wants to pay. And when you get to redistribution from the rich to the poor, the answer is, if you do this, you'll drive out the rich, and therefore many cities feel they should not try to do it. So Peterson says, don't try to redistribute. Redistribution should be left to the state, or especially the national government. And that's the way the big redistributive programs of welfare, public housing, and public hospitals are heavily, heavily funded nationally. Money goes through the states and it goes down to the cities. But so the quick answer is there is some of that going on now, but the biggest dollar amounts tend to be from the federal government. 5 minutes. What about? Would you want to think about any of your papers? You have 10 papers, interesting papers. Do any of those connect with some of what I've talked about today? I've seen the titles, but I haven't seen most of the papers in detail. I just started. So if we think of vitality as a concept within cities, how and where might this what are some, with having some of your specific, that is, take a look at the paper there I gave you, I believe, called the Sociology of Buzz. You see that? Mm-hmm. What this does, and this is also adapted, and this is a paper with Dan Silver and I did. It's in a revised version. It's in the Scenescapes book, but turn on for a couple of figures. Let's look at the pictures, and I want to show you one or two things. Earlier than that. No, before. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, keep going. I was wrong. It may be there. Can you just let me see the picture a little bit? Contrasting cultural scenes, residential neighborhoods, political arenas, and industrial clusters. So what this has are cultural scenes, residential scenes, industrial clusters, political cultures. The idea is these are goals, agents. This is helping us to build a framework where we could compare cities within China or compare issue areas. So let's turn so we could find, for instance, the idea that industries have as a resource, which is money, and money is tend to build a product, and they have these are the dynamics of the industrial cluster. If we look at a political arena, it may be collective action, citizens, leadership, officials, power centers, ideology, party issues, and power in a sense. So these are classically often discussed. As the political arena deals with power, the industrial area deals with money. What we're adding, and here's the resonance, what we add is the cultural scene. This is new. And so what this, in a sense, is these will have more activism or more energy within each of these areas, but they have drivers of different resources that have mechanisms that have work, that have a dynamic that is different in these four areas. Let's turn a little further. There's another figure. So what I'm trying to do is link with Yeah, okay, let's look at this. Okay, here we have political context shift the values of resources. So we can have a business-dominated issue, such as rebuilding the hospital area by Michael Reese. And the resources which are important can be money, which is high, and we score these resources high, medium, or low. So if we have a business dominant situation, money should be high, votes should be low, community influence should be low, political leaders should be low, and the aesthetic buzz should be low. By contrast, if we come to a culturally dominated issue or a strong egalitarian kind of political system, these would have different resources with different prices in a sense, but they would, that is, how much could you convert a certain amount of money into building a street or getting people to join a club together. So the idea is the New England values which Elazar stressed gives you the idea of what are the legitimate rules of the game, what's good. And you could think, for instance, you have a Padrone, an Irish political leader, or you have a Moses as an ethical leader trying to we're at the end of it's noisy because it's the end of the class. Okay, so we should try to keep it. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is read and think about using this in your own work, and we'll go on and continue that in the future. But the readings give us pieces which we want to join together, and read in your case, which you can see the discussions from Alex. He did this very nicely, and you can go further.
Okay.
All right.
I put although it's not really related to any of the readings that we've read so far, but I did that memo on the hostile architecture.
Yeah, but I apologize for not getting back to you, as it's just been an absolute busy week. But yeah, anything you want to raise as a question now of helping you do what to do next or whatever?
Yeah, like what do you think a good topic I could write on for this week would be?
I would say maybe the best guide could be, or one guide could be to look at what Alex, that is what we've done today and some of briefly in the discussions. Scattered through this are Chicago examples.
If you could think of like one principle or concept that you discussed today, what do you think has the most importance?
Yeah, maybe where and how the rise of reform, the role of, that is the Harold Washington Harold heard it from his speechwriter, who was Bill Grimshaw. Bill Grimshaw was the campaign manager. He was professor at IIT, political science. He and I worked for over 10 years developing this oral history of Chicago. He wrote, and they had it in the north side speech. Harold said, "We need to have reform," and the crowd said, "Yes!" And so afterward, Harold said to Bill Grimshaw, "What's reform?" Okay, Harold Washington had no idea what this would be. So Bill Grimshaw has done a couple of papers, and he tried to adapt it to Chicago, because and the idea was the Chicago version was different from what was done in, say, in the state of California or the International City Management Association, or there are many different concepts of reform.
Right.
But they may go back to Calvinism, they may go back to Jane Addams and to the New Englanders. But the way that it came from African Americans came in part from reaction against slavery. And so the salience of fighting against hierarchy, which was similar to the political machine, got defined in terms of making us free. And so that the free idea with that resonance with slavery as the background gave it an ethnic tone. And so, but enough so that also had ways that it could then be used in Chicago. So one kind of theme could be to look at the ways that terms like reform have been variously transformed, and they're I'll send you. Do you have anything from Alex beyond what's posted, or do you have anything from him? No. Have you looked on campus?
I looked on campus, yeah. I just looked through those posts, but none of them are his.
See, none of them are his?
No.
Okay. So then, what we've done in the course is to have people, and he sent me one MS Word document, I think, with all of his postings. So he wrote them week by week.
Oh, okay. Should I do that? Like a continuous document, then the edits will get cut in.
Yeah. So you can.
How many should I aim to have?
If you do one a week, that's what he did.
Is that 9 weeks?
Yeah. And then the readings can match with your essays. If you connect with something in Chicago, but linking to these bigger themes in China and France and so forth, then we can try to say, how and why is, so to me, how and why might these bigger frameworks of how values and culture get transformed, and then we have interesting combinations of these, say in later sections on scenes where we have 15 dimensions.
But in terms of reform, what do you mean? Societal reform, political reform, or in what sense?
I'm trying not to go too far, but I would say look at the readings and look if you will at what I looked at. This is flash forward. The idea of buzz is a major thing which Alex and I and the third guy from the Orange County were working on. We're still working on it right now. This is a central theme that there's a team. There are teams working in China, Canada, U.S. What's your fourth country? Japan.
Japan.
Yeah, Japan, China, U.S. and Canada. Okay. We're working on each of these, and we're looking at variations we have within them, within their cities, within their neighborhoods. We have more energy, more dynamism for moving to one street, one neighborhood. Why? Whereas others such as the street, the steel areas of Chicago are dead. They're closing down factories, homes. Where and why the Google neighborhood just on the side of Chicago is booming. That's why. So buzz, and then I'll send you some things based on that. But we should also especially send you Vi and other stuff with Alex. Alex wrote some very smart things, pulling these together, moving into the next quarter as well. Okay. Yeah.
So sorry for disturbing. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah. Here we go.
Kobe, Andrea, would you guys mind coming in to set up?